Hi everyone, I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. This is already our 9th talk in the Cold War Spaces series. Today's guest is Kate Brown, Professor of Science, Technology, and Society at MIT. We'll be talking with Joes Segal, the Wende's museum, the museum's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. And today's topic is contaminated space, long radioactive half-lives, and short media cycles in Chernobyl. Kate Brown is an environmental historian who studies large-scale disasters in modernist wastelands. She's the author of 4 books, including Plutopia, Nuclear Families in Atomic Cities, and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters. Her most recent book, Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future, came out last year. You may have also seen her article, The Pandemic is Not a Natural Disaster, this April in the New Yorker. This is going to be about a 30-minute talk, and after that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So please get ready to type your questions into the Q&A box during that time. We welcome all of your questions and we really appreciate them all, but we do sometimes get too many to get to in the time allotted, so we apologize if we can't get to yours. Additionally, this recording will be available to watch on our Vimeo later today if you'd like to rewatch or share with those who couldn't make it, or if you'd like to watch past talks in the series. I'd also like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting this discussion series at the Wende and all of our virtual programs. Joes, let's get started.
Okay, thank you, Anna Rose. So the explosion in reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986 is engraved in public memory as a defining moment of the late Cold War years. It has left us with many open questions, historical disputes, and even competing television series. And we seem to know disconcertingly little about the long-term effects. Is the story of Chernobyl a closed chapter for the history books, or are we turning a blind eye to the ongoing consequences of radioactive leaks and nuclear weapons tests? In times of fake news accusations and a fundamental distrust towards scientific knowledge, what do we actually know? And last but not least, how does the crisis of Chernobyl compare with the global pandemic we are experiencing right now? It's a great pleasure to discuss these grim questions with my distinguished guests today, Professor Kate Brown. Kate, welcome to Cold War Spaces. And let me start, if that is okay, with a startling figure. The official death toll number as a result of the explosion in Chernobyl is between, I think, 33 and 54 people. In historical perspective, that sounds like nothing. So what are we talking about? And why is Chernobyl such a big story?
Well, those are the official figures. And I was really surprised when I started working on this book a few years ago, that that's what you find when you go to a UN website, or if you try to, the New Yorker or New York Times tries to fact check a number, that's what they come up with, 33 to 54 dead from the disaster. And, you know, you travel in places like Ukraine or Belarus, and anecdotally, you meet 54 people who have dead relatives attributed to Chernobyl in about 3 days of wandering around. And so I decided when I started working on this book, I was going to try to figure out, you know, what does that number mean? Is that the closest we can get to that number? And as soon as I started to unearth a huge cache of archives in the Ministry of Health records, first in Ukraine, then Belarus, then Russia, I found an astonishing record of massive contamination of hundreds of thousands of people, mostly through foodways. We often think of radioactivity as waves that come from X-ray machines or from bombs, and they travel through our bodies and they do damage and they keep on going. But what people in the Chernobyl regions were doing were eating food that was contaminated. Almost everything was contaminated with radioactive fallout from Chernobyl, but some of it was really contaminated. In fact, a couple of years ago, I noticed all kinds of people were picking blueberries from the marshes around the Chernobyl plant. And I went blueberry picking too, and then I sold the blueberries to the wholesalers on the street, and I went to the warehouse with them. And there they were using a wand to measure the radioactivity of all the blueberries they purchased. And I asked, how many of these blueberries, this is 2017, 30 years after the accident, how many of these blueberries are radioactive? And the woman said, who was buying, said, all the berries are radioactive, but some are really radioactive, like 3,000 becquerels a kilogram. The norm, the permissible threshold was 450. becquerels a kilogram for Ukraine at the time. So 3,000 was much higher.
Wow,
And
so
then
they realize that this is the issue and they still eat and buy it?
well, no, you eat and buy it.
Ah, right.
You know, we eat and buy it. Those
Yeah.
Ukraine's berries go into Poland where they're processed as wild organic blueberries, and then they're sold throughout the EU. And I found Homeland Security records showing that those blueberries from Ukraine were crossing the border between the U.S., Canada, from Canada into the U.S. And the reason I found that is because there was reports of a big truck with a radioactive mass inside, and that mass inside were blueberries from Ukraine. So that Chernobyl radiation is still circulating around the globe in foodways.
That's amazing. One of the many crazy stories you uncovered has to do with contaminated meat. There was this train going around for 3 years through parts of the Soviet Union in an attempt to actually bring radioactive meat on the market. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, you know that right after, and let me share my screen and I'll show you some images. Right after the accident, all kinds of, there was about 100,000 head of cattle that were out in the fields. And, well, yeah, let's see, here we go. All kinds of cattle were out in the fields, and they were told to go and kill those cattle because they were getting, they were sick. They were showing signs of, you know, sort of sores and cuts. Can you see that image now?
We see a map now.
You see a map. So what I found is that right after the accident, pilots went up from Moscow and they seeded the clouds so that radioactive contamination fell on rural Belarus rather than urban Russia, because these big storm front was heading from Chernobyl directly towards the big cities, including Moscow. So these pilots seeded the clouds and they made it rain in this area here. And you can see right here, this is where the Chernobyl plant was. And this is, you know, this big red angry cloud of radioactivity. The pilots held off as they went over this big city of Gomel. And then here, they made it rain 3 days after the accident when the fires were still burning. And this created a second Chernobyl zone that very few people have ever heard of. I visited it. It was largely populated until about 1999. But now it's pretty much depopulated, and it looks and feels a lot like this Chernobyl zone that tourists go to. So this was a triage operation, you know, make it rain in rural areas where there are fewer people in order to save urban areas. The only problem is they didn't tell anyone in Belarus that they were doing this, including the leader of the Belarusian Communist Party. So in this area down here, about 200,000 people lived and farmed and continued to do so well after the accident. And so what we find is all these cattle there, these are milkmaids. And so they got the order, you know, slaughter 100,000 head of cattle and other livestock and send it to the meatpacking plants. Now, this is why I called my book a manual for survival, because I find all these strange new instruction manuals in the archives that for a new sort of post-nuclear world, the kind likes of which nobody had ever had before. And so the Soviets wrote a manual for meat packers. This is what you do with radioactive meat. You grade it, low, medium, and high levels of meat. The low and medium levels of meat you mix together with clean meat and you make sausage. And you send it all over the Soviet Union. You label it as you normally would, just don't send it to Moscow. Now the high level meat, put in freezers and wait till it decays. The strongest radioactive isotopes decay. So quickly, I see from places like Gomel, the meat packing plants are asking for more freezers. They don't have enough. They keep asking for freezers, keep asking for freezers. They have so much high-level radioactive meat. And so finally, they get a train car, refrigerated train car, and they shove in 300 tons of high-level radioactive meat, and they send it to Baku. In Baku, the alarms went off, and Baku sent it to Yerevan, and so on. That radioactive ghost train circulated the western half of the Soviet Union for 4 years until finally in 1990, the Ukrainian KGB buried it inside the Chernobyl zone where it probably should have gone in the first place.
That's amazing. And in Baku and Yerevan and other places, they realized what was going on, or
Yeah,
how did they know about it?
They just had, you know, sensors, radiological monitoring at the train stations, and you know, they knew that Chernobyl had happened, and everybody was nervous about radioactive food.
Right. So there have been several publications on Chernobyl, but also an award-winning HBO television series from last year. And I heard there is a television series in the make for Russian television as well, with its own take on the history, which evolves, I think, around a CIA plot. Can you tell us a little bit about these different representations and in how far they have any connection with what actually happened?
Well, you know, they are made for TV dramas,
Right.
fiction by nature. I think the makers of the HBO series got things a little confused by saying, you know, we really, you know, this is about truth and lies, and we're telling the truth, and other people were telling lies, the Soviet leaders were telling lies. And that's indeed true. But that doesn't mean a fictionalized show is also the truth. The interesting thing I found about the HBO Chernobyl series is that they followed the playbook of Soviet propagandists, interesting ways. About a month after the accident, a big high-level circular went out to the Soviet press agencies and said, this is how we're going to cover the Chernobyl accident. We're going to emphasize and lionize the sacrifice of the liquidators. Those are people, mostly men, who helped to clean up the radioactive waste and got themselves contaminated along the way. We're going to tell everybody that radiation is safely contained inside the zone. We're going to make scapegoats out of the plant operators and blame it on them. And finally, we are going to close this chapter and make sure that we have an ending date to this accident. It's not going to go on, even though we know that radioactive contaminants, the half-life of plutonium is 240,000 years. So right. These accidents do go on in a way that humans can't even comprehend. So because the makers of the Chernobyl series very faithfully used primary sources and Soviet sources, they followed the press reports, they followed the books, and especially the photography that came out of the Soviet media in the years after the accident. So I could watch them reproducing this photograph and that scene, and so they did exactly what the propagandists had done in their show. They lionized the liquidators. They made it a story that was just about the Chernobyl zone itself. You know, the immediate plant site itself. They gave it a starting date. You know, seconds ticking, and then the plant blows, and they gave it an ending date, the summer of 1987, when the plant operators were found to be guilty. But there's much more to the story than that, and that's what I was trying to do in my book, was talk about the long-lasting health and environmental effects of the accident. And outside of the zone, you know, if you leave the zone, you find places that are fully populated, but yet still contaminated with Chernobyl isotopes. Right. And people live, and they mostly farm and collect and forage in those areas.
Wow. Yeah. And what do you know, or can you tell us about the Russian television series?
Well, all I've heard is that they were pretty upset about the HBO Chernobyl series. And so they returned to what was an old, again, a Soviet rumor, a conspiracy rumor, which was that the CIA blew up the plant. And that was an act of sabotage. And that was the immediate thought of the KGB after this happened. Ukrainian KGB immediately started an investigation into sabotage as the cause of this accident. And they did a big investigation. You know, the Soviet KGB had a science and technology wing filled with engineers and scientists. And they went right in, and you see this in the show. They went and they talked to people who were witnesses to the accident and part of the accident, even when they're in their hospital beds. Mm-hmm. And they did this big investigation, and they reported on July 3rd, 1986, a KGB official gave a big report to Gorbachev and the Politburo, and they said, you know, we thought it was CAA or some kind of sabotage, but it wasn't. It was a design flaw with this reactor and operator error.
Right, right. So, yeah, one of the many revealing facts that came out of your research is the fact that the region of Chernobyl actually was already radioactively contaminated before this explosion. So what was the cause of that?
Well, I was really shocked to learn that, and let me share my screen again to show you. This gets a little complicated when I do this, but to show you what we're talking about, what kind of place this was. The Chernobyl accident occurred in Europe's largest marsh, which is called the Pripyat marshes. And you see that here in this map. This area outlined in red is the Pripyat marshes. And it's an absolutely beautiful ecological zone. There's 17 rivers transect this sandy bowl, and it breaks up into hundreds of lakes and streams and marshes. And one thing that nuclear power plants need is a lot of water, and that's exactly what the swamp served up to the nuclear power plant of Chernobyl. But at the same time, the Soviets had dried up big parts of the swamp for agriculture, but they left one area very swamp-like. And the reason they did that, this is the Omani swamp in Belarus, is because in 1960 they opened an Air Force bombing range. And I went and I asked a forester to give me a tour of this swamp, and I went and we saw a lot of spent ordnance. And we visited a lot of the old villages that had been in that area before it was turned into a bombing range. And all that was left were these old cemeteries. And we're standing around looking at the cemetery, and I see this bomb crater from the bombing range. And I look at the pine trees in it, and the pine trees look strange to me. And I get a little closer, and I see that these pine needles, which are supposed to be straight, they're all supposed to go in the same direction if they're normal pine needles. But you can see these pine needles are curling, and they're spinning off in different directions, and they're what biologists would call disorganized. And that is from some kind of mutation, and there are a couple of things that can cause pine trees to mutate, but radioactivity is a major stimulant of those kinds of mutations. And so I started looking around. I filed this photograph away. I started looking around, and I found this map from a censored 1974 publication. And this map shows these, a team of Soviet scientists went to the Pripyat marshes in 1960 to 1964, and they did a radiological survey. And they found these really high levels of contamination. That was right where that Air Force bombing range is, and then levels around it. In fact, they measured everything, the air, the water, the soils, and people's bodies. And they found that people who lived on the margins of the swamp had 10 to 30 times more radioactivity in their bodies than people that lived in Kiev and Minsk. Now, mind you, this map was made 5 years before the Soviets built the Chernobyl plant, before they'd ever even broken ground on the plant. So this place was already contaminated with radiation beforehand. Yeah. Now, the censored publication says that this radiation is from global fallout, and they say it's most likely American bombs that created this fallout. But I saw on the record people speaking, but I couldn't get complete confirmation of it, of the Soviets testing small strategic nuclear weapons in this bombing range in the 1960s, and that would have locally exposed people in the ecological zone. So that is really interesting, because we think of Chernobyl as an accident that began in 1986 and it ended sometime in 1987, but really it might be better to think of Chernobyl as an acceleration. There was other times in this swamp where it was exposed before the accident occurred in 1986. In fact, I found that there was 104 nuclear accidents at the Chernobyl plant before 1986, before it really blew up. And there was several afterwards. There was another big blowout in 1991. I also found...
I wanted to say there's not only a missing end to the story, but also a missing beginning.
Yeah. I was in this is the red forest, and this took the hardest hit of radioactivity right after the accident, and the trees turned red, and you can see this picture here of the trees turning red, and foresters came in and they cut down the trees. And I was there in 2017, right after there had been a forest fire. And I don't know if you've noticed, there's been forest fires throughout the Chernobyl zone this summer in Ukraine. It's been an especially hot and dry summer. And so here we are in the red forest, and I expected about 100 to 50 microsieverts of radioactivity an hour, which is already more than enough to make me uncomfortable. But what I found is my Geiger counter was screeching. It's going up to 994 microsieverts an hour. And I asked the biologist I was following, what's going on? And they said, oh yeah, well, we had a fire here about 8 months ago, and it volatilized the radioactivity that was stored in the leaf litter and in the trees. And that was turned into smoke and ash and made basically a new nuclear incident that would have been ranked, if anybody had paid any attention to it, it would have ranked as a pretty serious nuclear event. And I think that tells us a little bit about these kinds of nuclear accelerations like Chernobyl and this 2017 fire, is that the long timescales of radioactivity and other chemical toxins wear out the human attention spans and human patience. We want to move on to the next event. We want this pandemic, for instance, already to be over. And we don't have, we produce these long-living toxins, and we don't have the patience to curate them until they're safely out of harm's way.
Right, so let me make this a little bit more general. There have been nuclear weapons tests all over the world since the mid-1940s up to the 1990s in many different countries: the US, the Soviet Union and Russia, United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, also more recently North Korea, with a total of more than 2,000 nuclear tests. How would you say all these tests have impacted and still impact our environment, and what are the long-term consequences of all this?
Yeah, the tests that were that are really of most concern are the tests that were atmospheric tests. Those that before 1963, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were the biggest bombers, and they blew up nuclear bombs furiously, and they blew them up into the atmosphere. After 1963, they agreed to bury them and blow them up underground, and that helped a lot. So let's look at Chernobyl in that perspective. One radioactive isotope that's pretty bad for human health is radioactive iodine. And this image shows that the Chernobyl radioactive iodine that goes right to the human thyroid, causes thyroid cancer, thyroid disease, and a host of other human health problems. Chernobyl issued 45 million curies. That's an awful lot of radioactive iodine. But just testing in the Nevada test site alone, in the continental heartland of the United States, was 150 billion curies of radioactivity, a whole another order of magnitude. So what does that mean? You're like, well, that good thing I wasn't in Nevada, you might think to yourself. But take a look at this map that shows the spread of radioactivity from the Nevada test site alone. Lots of other bombs are going off in the 50s and 60s, not just in Nevada, but this is just one test site alone. And you see here that the worst places are the brown areas. You see them in the heartland here around Nevada. But there's also all these brown spots that are in Minnesota and Iowa and parts of Wisconsin, and over here in Tennessee, and up here even upstate New York. And what happens is that you blow up a bomb, the radioactive fallout goes sky high, and then it starts to travel quickly with the trade winds. And then it comes down in precipitation. So you see here, these are sort of the dry states here in the middle of the Kansas, Oklahoma, the Dakotas. But right where you get to the humid Midwest, that's where you get these real hot spots, as hot as ground zero in Nevada. We have these places. And that is a real, like we think, what are the effects of that, right? Take a look at.
Do we know what the effects are?
No, we really don't. And this image is a little bit messed up because they're overlaid. But here you have thyroid cancer incidence in the United States over the years. this is in Canada, and you see these rates that just, they start to rise in the 1970s and they just go higher and higher and higher. This is the US map right here. They're just off the charts to this day. And this one is from South Korea. We have rates of cancer, gastric cancers are still going high, pediatric cancers are rising. In fact, cancers among people born after 1952 are on the rise. We don't know what the cause of that is, but I think we should get more curious about some of these toxins that have been emitted into the environment, especially since 1945, and that are damaging human health on the whole.
Yeah. So, Kate, you have written at some point, as a species, we respond better when we are in emergency mode than when we are in slow destruction mode. And I think this is a clear illustration. How do you think we can raise awareness of our process of gradual self-destruction?
Well, I think, that we often leave science to scientists. And those of us in the I'm a historian. I just went into the archives. For this book, I worked in 27 archives in about 7 different countries. And what I found was a shocking story of both the wide-scale contamination of people, of really great scientific work by scientists and researchers and doctors on the ground, and then great efforts by the Soviet government and international agencies, including the US Department of Energy, the National Cancer Institute, World Health Organization, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, to minimize the impact, the record of the impact of health consequences from Chernobyl. And I think what we can do is, those of us in the humanities can start to get more curious about science, to start to get more literate, ask more questions, and ask, why do scientists, when we ask scientists, what are the consequences of chronic exposures to humans of low doses of radiation? We know what happens when we get hit with high doses. We know that really well from the Hiroshima studies. We don't know what happens when people are chronically exposed to low doses, even though that has been a scenario for the last 60 years, and it is a likely continuing scenario. We should demand these studies. We should ask for the, scientists say, well, we don't know because we don't have any studies. The question should be, what's the politics behind that? Why is that happening? And I think we should put pressure on our leaders and our scientific institutions to answer these questions that are pertinent to us today.
Right. So we are almost at a 30-minute mark, but before we go to Q&A, I would like to ask you one final question. So currently, of course, we are experiencing another safety crisis. Do you see certain parallels between what happened after Chernobyl and the current pandemic?
Yeah. I mean, we see our leaders trying to minimize the problem because they're worried that the public will panic, will fall into hysteria. We also see, though, other consequences. Radioactive isotopes are tiny. We can't see them, we can't touch them, feel them, smell them. Same with the virus. And so one day, just like Chernobyl survivors, we woke up and we realized that our surroundings, the people next to us, our neighborhoods, were potentially dangerous. And we started to have a new understanding and a new awareness of the ocean of atmosphere that we live in, that we don't just walk through empty air, we walk through air filled with wonderful things like microbes and bacteria and pollen, but we also walk through air filled with pathogenic viruses and bacteria and toxins, chemical toxins, radioactive toxins, microbes with antibiotic resistance from feedlots. And I think we're becoming more aware of these invisible things in our environment that both are healthy for us and also a detriment. The other thing that we see very clearly after the Chernobyl accident and with this pandemic is that these kinds of crises don't affect all people equally, that people who are most vulnerable, often the poorest people who are have the least power, are hit the hardest. That often means working class people who do jobs and work with their hands and their feet and are out and exposed. And that our society doesn't do a very good job protecting either the people who are in the service industry or or delivering things or working in meat processing plants, either here or after the Chernobyl accident. We see the same kinds of people being affected much more terrifically than people who are white collar who can just run away. You know, after the Chernobyl accident, hospitals and health clinics were staffed in the Chernobyl areas at about 50% because doctors and medical personnel realized what was happening and they were the first to go.
Right, right. So social justice is another point where we should pressure the politicians to do more and be more aware. Thank you so much, Kate Brown. And we are going to the Q&A now, and I'll start with the first question by Bruce Hollihan. When a Ukrainian friend of mine confirmed that she and others were strongly exhorted to go outdoors and participate in the 1986 May Day festivities in Kiev, placing millions in danger by exposing them to nuclear radiation, it seemed to me to be a blemish or mark on the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev. What are your views about this, and how would you compare that to the Trump opinion that the USA ought to be opened up for business today, etc.?
Yeah, Gorbachev doesn't look so good in this Chernobyl accident as we see him in the West. He was very slow to respond. He was very concerned about what outside people would think about the Soviet Union. He was worried about prestige and losing face. The Ukrainian leaders said, we don't want to hold this parade. This parade will be really dangerous. The night before the parade, radioactivity levels in the city of Kiev spiked. But they were forced to do it by officials that came in from Moscow. And you know what Gorbachev did with this accident is he used it to clean house politically. He got rid of the guys he didn't want to have, you know, by saying, you know, you're responsible for this accident. He fired a lot of people. He used it as a political tool in his administration, but he didn't necessarily respond super well. And in many ways, it's like Trump saying, go back to work, we're going to get the economy back together because that's going to get me reelected. It's worrying about the big personal political picture for the individual leader rather than worrying about the public health of the citizens that leader is supposed to be protecting.
Yeah, so a very clear parallel here, you would say.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Our next question is by Louis Siegelbaum. The evidence you provide of cover-ups, intentionally falsified accounts, and the like is devastating and characteristically brilliant. But it also potentially stimulates a lot of conspirationalist assumptions about state institutions and their bureaucrats. That, it seems to me, gets uncomfortably close to deep state allegations that come from the extreme right of the political spectrum. My question is what can be done to de-weaponize that appropriation of your analysis?
Yeah, thanks very much, Louis Siegelbaum, for that question. The deep state, you know, when I started this book, there was, you know, for years there's been talk about the nuclear lobby, which is a kind of a deep state sort of conspiracy, that there's these people in the nuclear lobby that are that have been hiding information about deaths and health problems, and they want to like sort of slowly deceive us and possibly kill us just to keep their nuclear plants going. And I was very much aware of those allegations as I worked on this book. So what I did was I named individuals. This isn't a hidden conspiracy by a bunch of people all in concert. It's a story of a few, just really a handful of individuals working as scientific administrators inside the UN, for instance, and a handful of individuals, more than a handful of individuals in the Soviet Union who kept this going. But I find all along the way, people who I call sort of everyday heroes who realized what was happening, realized people were getting sick, realized food was contaminated, that workplaces were contaminated, and did their best to raise the alarm. And they did it even though their bosses tried to reprimanded them, tried to fire them, were successful at firing them. You know, it wasn't sort of, some of these former Soviet scientists said, you know, what, we had to do this because we were going to get shot, as you see in the HBO show, or we were going to get thrown in the gulag. That did not happen in 1986 or 8 to 1991. But people did sort of personally sacrificed to tell the truth. And there were so many more people who were doing that inside state agencies than the people, the powerful people who were trying to quelch it.
Thank you. The next one is from Erica Camisa Morale. Given what you said, it is clear that the Chernobyl accident was preceded and followed by other similar accidents, both in the USSR, in the USA, in Korea, and in other countries. Why then did this accident become so prominent?
Yeah, I think that has to do with images and the times. You know, when you hear this after the HBO show, a lot of political commentators said, yeah, those Soviets were really terrible and it could never happen here. And that's because the Soviets, everything about the Soviet Union was supposed to be awful. They had bad economics, they had bad politics, they had bad science and technology,
right.
Supposedly. But what we find is that we did already have, it had already happened here before 1986. I mean, we're the only country in the world that had the temerity to open up a nuclear test site in the continental interior. Every other country, the Soviets, the Brits, the French, tested in their colonial exteriors. They tested on other people. But the Americans blew up bombs, over 100 of them, right in the United States, exposing all kinds of Americans. We had 3 Mile Island that was effectively minimized by the leadership both in Pennsylvania and the Department of Energy. And then we produced nuclear weapons and just at a furious pace around those weapons factories, distributed nuclear radioactive waste. I wrote a book called Plutopia about the Hanford site that released at least 350 million curies of radioactivity. That's almost twice the estimates of Chernobyl. We don't know about these stories because of mythology about American know-how and great American technology. When the same kind of accident, a nuclear accident occurred in Japan, we all thought, oh, well, they'll do a good job. They'll clean it up. They wouldn't lie about it. But we find very similar patterns between Fukushima and Chernobyl.
Right, right. Okay, then the next question is by Donna Kent. Given the leadership we currently have in the US, how can we get leadership to deal with this? Well,
I think given the leadership we have right now, we're not going to see a whole lot of change. And we're not, we should wait. I mean, in fact, what has happened under the cover of the pandemic is that nuclear regulation has been softened and released, and the movement of nuclear objects and dangerously radioactive materials has sped up under cover of everybody paying attention to the pandemic counts. So these are things we need to pay attention to. We have historically built nuclear power plants, civilian power plants along waterways, coastal waterways along the Great Lakes. And these are aging plants. Some of them are 30, 40 years old. Some of them are still working. Some of them are being shut down. But all that radioactive waste, our radioactive waste in this country is homeless. And so it's being stored right on the coasts, all along the Pacific, the Atlantic coast, along the Great Lakes coast. And as we have climate change with rising water, we have a potentially a big problem at our hands, and we're not addressing that at all.
Right. So I want to take 2 questions together. The first is by Aniko Imre. Is there any research or data on contamination spreading west to the rest of the Eastern Bloc, for instance, Hungary and Poland? And maybe you can combine that with the question by Esther Elliott. What do you think, how safe it is to eat any food item coming from Ukraine today, including bacon and sausages?
Yeah. So there are maps showing the spread of contamination into East and West Europe, and you can find those maps online, and you can see some of them are quite detailed. What you don't see, strangely, Turkey is just a blank spot because evidently Turkey didn't allow measurements to be happen. We do know that Turkey was contaminated. That map sort of corresponds with kind of random wind and rain patterns. So some areas like the Alps, southern Germany, Austria, got hit very hard. Greece and parts of Bulgaria got hit hard. So the maps will tell you a lot. As far as eating food from Ukraine and Belarus, I think the real danger is to eat a lot of food from those areas, to eat it every day. The people who live there and farm there, they are in danger, and we see dramatic changes in long-term health statistics. The, one study shows that they tend to live about 15 years on average shorter lives than people elsewhere in Ukraine and Belarus. Birth defects, a certain kind of neurotube birth defects that cause spina bifida and encephaly are 6 times higher in northern Ukraine than in the rest of Europe. And the parents' bodies have much higher counts of radioactive cesium. Right. And that is from ingesting food. But if you're worried about eating blueberries that you think might come from Ukraine, a health physicist would tell you that we all have radioactive contaminants in our bodies, and that is from the legacy of nuclear testing. And what I tried to show in my presentation is that legacy is an order of magnitude greater than Chernobyl contaminants. So you should be just as worried about eating Minnesota wheat.
Right, that's clear, yeah. I have another question from Erika Camisa Morale. Could you explain us the methodology you used in conducting this research? How long did it take you to collect all the information? And I think that's an interesting one because your approach has been so multidisciplinary and included not only archival research, but also interviews and actually biological research. So can you expand a little on that?
Yeah, I'm an historian, so the first thing I did is I went into archives, and I found that I was often the first person to check out these archives that had to do with health and the Department of Agriculture. And as I said, I found such a shocking story. I started to get nervous that nobody would believe me. And I started to get nervous too. I mean, like I knew that people lie, and I could see people lying in the archives. And so if people lie, then archives lie. Just because it's documented on paper doesn't mean it's true. And so that's when I thought, well, maybe trees don't lie. And so that's when I turned to foresters and biologists, and I started following them as sort of a participant observer to figure out if I could try to read radioactive contamination in the landscape. And it turns out you can't, see or touch radioactivity, but you can certainly see its fingerprint on a plant, on forests, on all kinds of organisms. And so that was very useful for me as I traveled around to have that education. Right. I talked to a lot of people. A lot of people wrote the Soviet government in the 1980s, telling the Soviet government about the problems in their community and asking for help. And I got those names and addresses, and with my research assistant, we went to try to find those people 30 years later and interview them and see what they had to say. And that was really fascinating. And then finally, I did things like, I went undercover blueberry picking to try to experience what it's like to live in those kind of places now. Right. So putting that all together, I felt like I got as close as I could to this story with the 4 years I had to do this research. And there's still lots more to be done, and I hope other researchers will go and ask other kinds of questions.
Yeah, well, we should add undercover blueberry picking to the toolkit of the historian, I guess. I have one last question here. Is there any truth to animals or plants displaying weird or abnormal traits due to radiation in the exclusion zone?
Yeah, you don't have to be in the exclusion zone to see them. Let me show you an image here. Real quickly, if I can get to it. And that is, take a look at these trees. This is inside the red forest. And these are pine trees. And as I said, pine trees are vulnerable to radioactive decay. And so these little pine trees that look more like shrubs are trying to be pine trees, but they can't get organized enough to grow straight and tall like they're supposed to. Here's another. This is outside the Chernobyl zone, but this is where we were just traveling around, and I saw this tree. Now, this tree was planted to grow board straight for lumber. This is a commercial forest. But you can see this pine tree didn't get that message. It has all these strange morphological twists and turns. that are another sign of radioactive contamination. I saw a lot of people with birth defects, and there's no way of knowing, what the cause of those were. I didn't like to take pictures of people.
Of course. Yeah.
But what you see is sort of a resonance between historic pictures of animals, farm animals from that time. These kind of long-term, trees grow much more slowly and have much longer lives than humans and animals. But you see a resonance between them.
Right. Thank you. So we are at a time, but I would never forgive myself not asking you one final question. What is your take on nuclear energy as an alternative to fossil fuel energy?
Well, when I first started doing nuclear history, I was agnostic. I was actually, as an environmentalist, I believed, the big environmental groups, that nuclear energy was the way to stop, to break climate change. But now we're finding, not only for the reasons of health and environment, that nuclear power is a dangerous source of power to play with, but also that it's too expensive. Like all of these nuclear power plants produce energy that's at least 2 times more expensive, sometimes more than solar and wind energy. It just doesn't make sense. I think why governments and corporations have pursued with such a vehemence nuclear energy is because it's you can meter it centrally, you can control it centrally. Corporations can make a lot of money from it, where if you put a nuclear power plant on top of every building, where I am in Washington, D.C., sunny city, and you put, not far from here on the Chesapeake, you put wind turbines, that is decentralized power with decentralized profits from that power. And I think we should think about that. The kind of power we have determines in large part the kind of societies we have. So if we have decentralized, more egalitarian power, we might have a more egalitarian societies and states.
Great, thank you. I want to conclude with a comment by Iris Klaver, who writes, "No question, just want to thank you for the powerful message that history is sedimented in the environment." And I can only confirm that. Kate Brown, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation today. It was really enlightening. Next week, my guest will be Robson Thijs-Frazier, Associate Professor of Communication and Director of the Institute for Diversity and Empowerment at Annenberg at USC, under the title Community Space, Multimedia Art and African American Community Formation in Los Angeles. Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for watching. Okay, and hope to see you next week. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Great. Bye-bye.